2008 and 9, there was the Lehman Brothers who collapsed. And you, of course, know about some of the housing market which drove that crisis.
What was that subject which you were totally bad at? Like, we all have that one subject where we all suck. What's that one thing which India can learn from New Zealand and New Zealand can, kind of learn from India? If you have to just give that one lesson. In today's times, when economic uncertainty is at its peak due to the ongoing Israel-Palestine war and the Russia-Ukraine war, the need for brilliant economic minds as well as bureaucrats is more crucial than ever. And today on the podcast, we had the honor and the pleasure to host one such brilliant economic mind, Mr. Harshal Chitale. From studying at the prestigious Brown University in the US to becoming the Principal Economist at the New Zealand government, he has redefined the way the world economy works. Having decades of experience in highly specialized fields such as urban and environmental economics, today we are going to shed some light on topics that truly matter to you. We'll be discussing as to how India can become the #1 economy in the world. How does the government really work? Lessons from New Zealand's economy that India can implement to become a better nation. And also how we as youngsters can contribute to the growth and development of India. So if you're someone who is a student, a working professional, or just curious about how the world works, don't forget to check out the entire video till the end. Also, if you're new to the channel, do hit that subscribe button so that you never miss out on such an informative video like this one. Now let's dive right in and hear it out from none other than Harshal Chitale. Welcome to the Baatcheet podcast, Harshal. Thank you so much for taking out the time. I know you've been very busy with the working with the government and all of that, but thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much, Surya, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I was reading about your journey and you working with the Ministry of Environment in New Zealand. So how has been your journey so far and how did you actually start with all of this?
That's a pretty sort of long sort of answer, I suppose. I got interested in the field of economics in high school, actually. So I had a very interesting high school economics teacher. A very old gentleman, and he used to make it fun, basically. So he used to tell a lot of stories, and kind of what interested me a lot was I always was quite scientifically minded, but I also was quite a keen observer of people around me and why they chose certain actions over others, or how they made decisions and how they thought about situations, and therefore how they responded to them. So I felt like economics captured both a little bit of scientific temper and some scientific discipline. But what the interesting part to me was that it merged that with the real world decision making of human beings, which is not necessarily sort of there in if you study the natural sciences like physics or chemistry. There you have kind of defined interactions between different scientific sort of equations and that kind of stuff, whereas in economics you have the human factor, which I found very interesting, and that's how I kind of started to get interested in economics. But I would say the initial inspiration was in high school when I started getting interested in it, and then I continued studying it through my undergraduate, and then I really fired up my interest at Delhi School of Economics when I did my master's there, because we had excellent sort of researchers teaching us, so they had all done their research degrees, PhDs in the top universities and the research departments globally. If you think about the US, you can imagine the Yales and the Princetons and MITs, or the London School of Economics. And so we were exposed to the latest kinds of thinking in the field, the latest lines of research inquiries in the field. And that's always an inspirational way to fire up a young mind at that impressionable age. And so I got interested in a couple of subfields called game theory, microeconomics, because I had those kinds of professors, and I found those topics very interesting. And I used to enjoy a little bit of mathematics as well, so those had a little bit of mathematic rigor. So I started off getting interested in those kinds of fields, and then I wanted to study further, and then I studied further, etc. But it's a long journey. I started working after my master's in the US, so I went to Brown University, did another master's, and again I was exposed to cutting edge research. And there, of course, at an international program like that, you get exposed to people from different cultures and different backgrounds. So although you're studying the same subject, it's fascinating to see the different contexts that people are coming to it from. So someone coming from, let's say, Nigeria, and the kinds of issues that that person is interested in studying, you can learn a lot from that. Or someone from Greece, made a couple of good friends from all over the place. Or someone from Korea, for example, what was interesting to them in terms of economics. So that was a very fascinating experience in getting exposed to very, very different perspectives, I would say. And of course, the field of economics itself. I could explore many more sort of micro topics within the subject. So that was very interesting. And then I started working, and then my work life led me one after the other. My first few jobs were in a field called competition economics, where if you think about markets in general, and if they are dominated by one or two big players, monopolies or duopolies, right?
Yeah.
Then there can be a problem for consumers, because the monopolist or the duopolist can charge fairly high prices because they don't really have competition. And so in a lot of the developed economies, and of course in India as well, you have competition commissions and regulatory bodies which try to deal with these sorts of issues. So my first few jobs were in competition economics in the private sector. In the UK, I worked in a very good consulting firm, and we used to do a lot of work for private clients who were undergoing transactions, for example, mergers or takeovers. And if there were competition concerns, then they had to convince the competition authorities, like the Competition Commission in the UK, for example. Or at that time, the European Commission had become effective. So if they were operating their businesses in a lot of European jurisdictions, then that case had to be looked at in all those markets. So maybe there might be an issue in the German market or the French market or the Swiss market, and so the European so the cases could either go to the Competition Commission, let's say in the UK, or the Director General of Competition for the EU, the European Commission, depending on where the businesses were active. So that exposed me to lots of very interesting problems. And just expanded my sort of vision in the field quite a lot. How I ended up in New Zealand is interesting. I went there on a long holiday initially. I had a lot of leave. Built up, and I had a relative of mine who used to live. Actually, my mama used to live in New Zealand, and my family was visiting at that time. And I had a lot of leave built up, and as an Indian citizen, you always need to apply for a visa to go anywhere.
Yeah.
So I tried my luck. I got the visa, and it was a 3-4 week holiday that I ended up in New Zealand, and I really loved the place. I found the balance of city and nature quite interesting, and I've always enjoyed sort of exploring new places and everything. And at that time, the global financial crisis had hit the UK as well. My job was secure, but definitely.
All of that.
Correct. So 2008 and 9, there was the Lehman Brothers who collapsed.
Yeah.
And you, of course, know about some of the housing market which drove that crisis with the subprime lending and banks having lent so much money to the housing market all over the world, especially in the US. And then all the derivatives that were built on top of those mortgages. And Lehman was exposed to that, and that was the big one to go under. And it had a rippling effect in the market. And so one memory of mine was where we were a consulting firm, economic consulting firm, dealing, as I said, with competition economics issues, mergers and acquisitions. But that year, apparently, we had, I think 20,000 applications from investment bankers because they were suddenly out of a job. And London was a hub for investment banking.
Yes, investment banking.
Maybe it was 2,000, I can't remember, but it was still a huge number, just trying their luck in wherever they could find. So that was the kind of crisis that had happened in those markets, and it was an interesting time. I wanted to explore other parts of the world, and as I said, that trip was very fascinating for me.
The New Zealand one.
Correct. So that's how I decided, let me try something here. And I met a couple of professors at the University of Auckland over there, and they encouraged me to write some research proposals and etc. So my first job in New Zealand was actually as a researcher, and I did some lecturing at the University of Auckland. So that's how I ended up in New Zealand.
But did you ever think that you will be becoming a professor one day, like from actually studying economics yourself
So-
to teaching economics?
so
And
pro-
were you always like a studious boy in school? Because I'm getting that very studious kind of vibe from you. That you
I
are-
will say I was always a thinker.
Okay.
Very deep thinker. So any issue I used to go my mind used to run wild with questions. So I used to question it from every perspective, top, down, left, right, scientific, non-scientific, social, psychological, individual, collective. I used to try and understand it from every angle. So my mind is just like that. It's just very constantly asking questions. So before I find out an answer to one question, my mind has produced 10 more questions, which can often be a problem. Because
Same happens with me sometimes actually.
it's a natural curiosity, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
Curious minds always, we are constantly, questions are popping up in our head.
Yeah.
Why this,
Yeah.
So that question, that perspective was always there. I think I was pretty studious. I come from a fairly, background where education is encouraged. Our community, especially Maharashtrian sort of, education was the only asset really. We are not massive kind of business owners or that sort of stuff. So education is the currency. To progress. So that was there, and I enjoyed what I was studying most of the time. Some of the subjects, no, but that's fine.
What was that subject which you were totally bad at? Like we all have that one subject where we all suck.
So in high school, for example, in the 11th and 12th, I remember you have to choose a stream. Sort of, you have to pick. I did the ISC board, so you have to choose, I think, 4 subjects as electives.
Okay.
So initially, I had selected maths and economics. I always liked those, and I had selected physics and chemistry. But unfortunately, so what used to happen in our school was they used to rotate the teachers. So they used to alternate 2 sets of teachers between the 11th and 12th. So if someone was teaching the 11th standard this year, they would not teach the 11th standard the next year. They would carry on with the 12th standard with that batch. And then another 2 sets of teachers used to pick up the next 11th standard.
Okay.
So the interesting ones who I liked for physics and chemistry were not the ones we got. So I took physics and chemistry. So I think I was very teacher and inspiration driven. Conversation and who could fire me up. I was that kind of, I didn't respond to.
I guess a lot of students are like that because if you find a good teacher, people genuinely get that curiosity to dwell deeper into that subject.
I think so. I think I was like that, definitely. I think everyone learns in different ways, but I was definitely, some people are genuinely interested in a particular subject. Like I knew some people were just, they love biology, they knew they wanted to do, become a doctor or take medicine. I was more responding to whoever could fire me up in something or the other. I used to love chemistry actually, and I was pretty good at it, and I used to love chemistry, but because of I shouldn't put all the blame on the teachers, but I did get a little bit bored. So a couple of weeks later I said ye mujhse nahi hoga. Because I had to take
chemistry with economics really developed after that.
Yeah, I'm actually doing some work on organic soils and all that kind of stuff now. So I've actually had to delve into a little bit of chemistry. But we have a lot of scientists obviously in the ministry who do the real science, and I kind of tap into their knowledge. So it's once you start working in cross-functional teams, then you learn from a lot from other fields anyway. So as a curious mind, you can always tap into people's knowledge, and people are happy to share. If you're tackling a challenge together, or you're trying to solve a problem together, everyone has a incentive to help each other out. So you can learn from a lot. But that's how I kind of at that stage I kind of decided no, that's not for me at that point.
And I should switch to economics as a core function.
Yeah, and then as I said, I had a very good economics teacher, so I got interested in the subject, and then I used to naturally read about those kind of economics news or that kind of stuff. So I got interested in that, basically. Yeah.
And since all the people are talking about this global recession which is on our way, and since you talked about the Lehman Brothers crisis and all of that, so could you basically explain to our audiences what a recession is? So in simpler terms, as if you are explaining to a 5-year-old, and how would you do that?
Sure. So if you think about the economy, right, in the marketplace, right, we are all either consumers or producing something or investing in things, right? Yes. So we earn an income, we work, we earn income. Out of that, we consume our necessities or luxuries, whatever that might be. Save some of that money which we might want to lend to someone or invest in a business, which is stock market investment or bond market investment or a corporate bond investment, etc. So what are you doing? You're giving out your money because you believe in that business, because it's going to generate some returns for you, right? So either you're a consumer or an investor. or you might be producing something yourself. You might be a entrepreneur. You might have a business of your own. So you're delivering a good or a service to the economy. So the way economic kind of success has been measured especially since the Second World War, the metrics used are GDP, gross domestic product.
Can you break that down as well?
Yeah, so it is basically, if you think about all the goods and services that are getting manufactured in, let's say, India today, right?
Yes.
What the gross domestic product actually measures is how much value has the economy added in a particular time period. So usually it's measured as an annual or a quarterly, right? So in this year, for example, let's say all the raw materials that were used, all the capital that was used to produce whatever was used to produce, what value was created by that production. So what did the consumers pay for all that production? Mm-hmm. But then you net out what resources went into producing that amount of output. So that is the value add.
Basically the profit margin.
Correct. So the value added by the economy is a measure of the gross domestic product. That's what it measures essentially, is how much value have you created in the economy. Mm-hmm. And because the way we trade between ourselves is through a monetary system, right? It's not a barter system.
Yeah.
So I have to pay you in an Indian rupee or a New Zealand dollar for you to give me a good or a service. So that's how I express my valuation for that good or product. So whatever people are paying for all those products, net of all the resources that went into manufacturing that product, is a measure of your GDP. So that's what it measures, what value added. Now what happens is, to increase your standards of living, your value that you're producing should keep increasing, because that's how wages get paid out. Yes. Salaries get paid out out of the earnings, out of the value that's getting generated. That's how the return to capital gets paid out. So if you think about the factors that are producing goods, main are labor and capital, and then there are the risk takers and the entrepreneurs. That's a very important factor of production, obviously. But the returns to them are being paid out of the value being generated. So when a business goes bust, the salaries can't be paid, so you have people who get unemployed. Okay, returns to capital are not going to get generated, so investors start losing money, right? And the entrepreneur obviously takes a hit as well, and might have to declare, in the extreme circumstance, declare a bankruptcy. So essentially it's all about generating and creating value. So a recession starts to happen when your GDP or value creation starts to take a hit, in some sense. Now that can happen in various ways. So one of the ways is when consumers stop demanding things for various reasons.
Okay.
Now that could be because the cost of production has started to go up. Things are getting expensive.
Inflation.
Correct? So what happens is, when the spending power in the economy goes down, right? So there is less purchases of goods and services. Then even producers won't produce that much. Okay, so
because there's no demand.
Yeah, so initially what will happen is, they may be producing something, let's say these chairs, right? They're bringing them to the market, and there's a inventory that they maintain, because there's a whole supply chain behind it to bring it to the retail store in front of you where you go and shop. So initially the inventories might build up when demand goes down, because that's not, it's not going through the retail channel anymore, because demand has gone down. So initially you might see it as an increase in inventories. So, cars are just sitting in showrooms, for example, or furniture warehouses are full, whereas, that stock might be funneling through the markets constantly in a well-functioning economy. So initially you might pick it up when inventories go up. Finally, if nothing sells, then the producers have to cut down actually further production.
Yes.
So because
and reduce the cost as well, and give discounts basically to
correct.
finish the unsold inventory.
Correct. So if the production cost is not going to go down, and if they have to cut their prices, their profit margins go down. So the value added goes down, because that's the measure of your value added from the producer side. Their profits go down, so they can't pay as much in wages. They have to think about cutting down employment, or they have to think about giving you, instead of 10% return, only 6% return on the investment that you made with them. So this is essentially the mechanics of how it all works. So a recession which is demand driven, right, which is what we are seeing now in the Western world. For example, I live in New Zealand. The scale of the problem is such that, so firstly we had COVID, March 2020. It hit big time. There were big time lockdowns. So immediately people are not traveling around at all. They may be purchasing stuff, essentials online, but things like tourism, any discretionary expenditure is basically come to a screeching halt. So the economy immediately, if you look at the data, it will look at the GDP numbers, they're straight down for a couple of months. But that might be a temporary blip because of lockdowns. Once that lockdown is gone, then people return back to the normal behavior. You'll see most of the electricity consumption, traffic movements, all the data coming back slowly to normal. Now what has happened in the meanwhile is monetary policy at that time. So what the central banks all over the world did in response to this demand shock. So they thought that suddenly there'll be a massive demand shock. People will stop demanding things, and then employers will start facing these problems of low demand. So they might start responding by reducing their production and finally their investment into their factories or whatever they're producing, which will create a problem for everyone. Standard of living will collapse.
And prices will increase basically because there's limited in inventory and still there's demand.
Correct, that could go both ways. Sometimes when demand collapses a lot, maybe the prices might stay suppressed for a while. But we'll come to that also with the monetary policies that have affected prices as well.
Like I remember this particular incident when, in Australia, there was this white toilet paper shortage actually. So the prices went up.
That could be correct. That could be supply chain induced also, but also lockdowns, because what has happened is people aren't able to go to the manufacturing plant. So then the plant might be actually running, very spare with social distancing. Instead of 100% capacity, you might be running only 30% of your assembly lines or whatever it is. So the production is taking a hit straight away because of the physical supply chain bottlenecks that were created by COVID. That is definitely an issue that it hit. So if you think about like container ships that were just stuck in ports because the staff wasn't turning up.
That's Suez Canal thing which happened.
Correct.
Yeah, evergreen.
So all of a sudden your shipping container freight rates will go through the roof because suddenly you have to pay much more. There's a log jam and you're not getting people to even work. So that's a supply chain induced kind of cost crisis that we have definitely seen hitting. You might have read about the energy problem because of the Russia-Ukraine situation as well. So that's
gas pipeline, basically something there happened. I'm not very sure as to what exactly happened, but some gas pipeline issue was there.
Correct, essentially. So Western Europe used to import a lot of energy from Russia. And so because of the tensions, that supply they have to find other sources, which is not easy to replace such a big volume of your supply all of a sudden from other channels. And then what's going to happen is if that goes offline, then the global demand hasn't changed because everyone needs energy. Energy is a basic commodity. So you have a few choices. Either you jack up are willing to pay up more prices and someone can fire up more production in other parts of the world, or that lower amount of production has to get rationed out to more or the same amount of demand, which will increase the cost, increase the price, which is what happened for Western Europe. All of a sudden, people were demanding much higher prices because they could from Western Europe. So unfortunately, that led to a massive cost crisis in energy bills for a lot of them, for the Western European countries. But coming back to some of the monetary policies at that time of...
What is a monetary policy? Because I have been a business student myself, and monetary policy and fiscal policy में लोगों को काफी confusion होता है, and अभी क्योंकि budget भी आने वाला है 2023 का, so if you could break that down, that would be a lot easier for everyone to maybe comprehend.
Sure. So think about it this way. Fiscal policy is essentially thinking about a government budget. So they have some income coming in. How does the government get its income? Through taxation, various forms of taxation, and that's again based on the value being generated in the economy. So because you have a GST, for example, which is a transaction tax. So when the economy is going really well, your GST collections will be good. Because there are a lot of people buying and selling. Okay, incomes are going up, your income tax collections will be high. Although India, there's a very small fraction that is made up by income tax. Most of it is indirect taxes, which has now all being consolidated into GST. In the past, we had state, if you cross the state borders, you had to pay state
toll tax.
And each state had different excise duties, different sales taxes.
Something about cess also. What's the difference between
I'm not 100% sure. Cess is a kind of a duty.
Okay.
And maybe there's some freedom for some states to charge a differential cess. But all those now have been harmonized under the GST system. So that has been one major positive change for India, which is a lot of these 28, 29, 30 states, which had all these different layers of taxation and differential tax rates, have now all been harmonized. So all India, every manufacturer of steel or coal or anything, you take that product across borders, you sell it to a final goods manufacturer, everyone pays the same goods and services tax rate. Imagine if there were differential tax rates across states. What does a manufacturer try to do? They try to locate themselves in the state with the minimum tax. So it distorts all kinds of incentives. Whereas when you have uniformity in taxation, firstly it takes away the administrative jumble of trying to file various tax returns if you have operations across states, all that sort of stuff. So it makes it easier to operate your business in the first place. But also it creates a kind of a uniform system where everyone is on a level playing field in terms of taxation. So the price signal sent to manufacturers is, no matter where you operate, your taxation will be similar. So although states can offer subsidies, they can offer other ways of attracting businesses. So they have freedom to kind of do that, but through other channels, but not through this GST system any longer. Correct. So government gets taxes or revenues, right? And then it has to spend money on programs. So education, healthcare, all our employment generation programs, environmental, their entire budget, railways, because not all of it will be commercially self-funding. So a lot of these operations are not self-funding. So railways, a lot of that will come from our tax revenues. Right? Because it may not be a commercially successful, completely profit-generating operation. I haven't gotten into the railway budget latest, but maybe they are actually generating quite a lot of revenues and maybe even generating profits. So don't quote me on that. But essentially you get the picture. Like all our public healthcare system, public education system is all state-funded, state and central government funded. So this is fiscal policy is where the government decides how to change the amount of tax and spending. Okay.
So that the day-to-day operations of the consumers.
So
basically B2B players, I would say, not generic and consumers.
Correct, and the economy in general. So one aspect is
macro view of the economy.
Correct.
That is handled by the fiscal policy.
Correct. So one aspect is you have to run the economy. You have to run all your services. So you have to spend on education, spend on healthcare. But in terms of this recession and managing what are called business cycles, so recessions and booms are called economic cycles.
Yes.
In economics, right? So when there are cycles like a recession, what the government can do is, because private spending has gone down, right? You want the economy to stay strong. The government can step in and step up, let's say, their investment program. So let's say it wants to build a whole heap of infrastructure, right? It can start investing in those projects now, or public housing, or other employment generation schemes which also build productive assets. If they want to undertake those, fiscal policy is actually spending money and investing in those things to get the economy going. Okay, so that's fiscal policy for getting for tackling the economic cycles. So what the kind of jargon in economics is, your policies should be counter-cyclical. So when the private demand is down, the government can step in with spending more to keep the economy going. So that's fiscal policy. Private demand as in, I don't want to invest anymore because now I'm not able to sell my products. So businesses stepping down their investments in a recession. Right. So the private economy is slowing down. So the chair manufacturer or the furniture manufacturer or the home building supply chain, construction activity might be pulling. Anything, right? Yeah. So if the demand is going down for everything, then even the producers they won't produce as much.
Because they are not.
They're not selling those products. Yeah, because those products are not moving. So initially the inventory might build up. Okay, they can absorb that for a while because there are storage costs. But beyond a certain point, they'll stay, reduce the production. Because now I don't have even the warehouse capacity to store it because the products are not selling in the retail channels. So that's how it builds up back to the top of the supply chain, and then the producers don't invest anymore or invest less. So then the government can say, so now how can we because that might have an employment impact, because when producers stop investing, private sector stops investing, that can have an employment impact. So either you'll have negotiations with the employees saying, we can have you at 80%, or we can have some kind of retrenchment, so those impacts are real.
This is happening with a lot of startups these days as well. They have to.
Correct. We can get into that as well, which was a huge bubble created by, I would say, very easy monetary policy. So I'll try to connect everything later.
Yeah.
So this is the fiscal policy aspect where the government itself can step in and spend. To counter the recessionary forces. Monetary policy is where central banks, okay, so central banks,
As in the RBI.
yeah, so in India's case, the Reserve Bank of India, in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, for example. What happened with COVID, for example, is it's a good way to illustrate monetary policy, right? What they try to achieve. So when they saw that COVID hit and it might lead to a large scale dip in the economy, because you never know, people might not be able to even go to work, so factories might shut down, there might be unemployment, demand might collapse. So what they tried to do, monetary policy, was they thought that they can get investment going again, trying to get people to spend again, if we drop interest rates. So they have some control over the cost of borrowing in an economy. So all the interest, correct. So what they do is they can control what is called the OCR. In New Zealand, it's called the OCR. It's called the official cash rate. So all the banks hold balances with the central bank. Cash balances. The reserve
cash reserves, minimum cash reserves.
Cash reserves. The Reserve Bank pays a little bit of an interest rate to them on those reserves. They can decide.
Because they have kept their money with the major bank.
Correct. It's like a cost of money, because you're holding it with us, we pay you something. And remember, Reserve Bank is also an entity which undertakes buying and selling of assets and all that stuff. So they are almost a corporate entity. They have a full functioning business. So they pay a little bit of a interest rate to these holdings. That is called in India the repo rate or whatever. In New Zealand, it's called the official cash rate. So what they did was they said, we want to get people to spend more and invest more again, particularly invest more, because we can see potentially a big recession coming. How can monetary policy try and do that? Let's drop the interest rates. So what is the control they have is on that overnight balance rate, okay? So the repo rate in India or the official cash rate in New Zealand. So they drop that. What happens when they drop that is the wholesale rates in the markets that the banks charge to other customers, etc. There's an incentive to drop those as well. So they pass those interest rate drops finally to the retail markets. So let's say a housing consumer wants to buy a house. They'll get those retail rates now at a lower rate. So that's the objective.
Can you basically explain that in a much simpler way? Like if you can probably quote an example so that.
Yeah. So for example, banks, let's say they get their funds from people's deposits. But they also borrow from lots of sources in the market, right? So lots of big funds, investors.
Hedge funds.
Correct. They'll invest in bank securities. So they sell bonds. So let's say you're a Axis Bank or ICICI Bank. They'll go to the market and sell corporate bonds, and people will invest in them. So they raise their capital through deposits of savers, but also they have borrowing. So what happens is when the central banks drop their interest rates, all the investors in the world, right? They also now have to start recalculating the return on investment that they will demand for various investments. So when the central banks drop their interest rates, the retail markets and the wholesale markets also drop the rate at which they are willing to lend. So the cost of capital for everyone starts to go down in general. Okay, so banks are also now raising capital at a lower rate in the markets. Okay, in the case of New Zealand specifically, what the Reserve Bank did was opened up another source of cheap funding for banks. So the objective, remember, is to make funding cheap for banks so that they can on-lend at cheaper rates to get investment and consumption going again. So that's how monetary channels try to impact the economy. But there were some unintended consequences of that. So what I think happened to a certain extent in some of the Western economies, in New Zealand also, was when interest rates dropped down all of a sudden, right? Banks also dropped their mortgage rates, so housing lending rates. In New Zealand, housing is one of the biggest investments that people make.
Okay.
It's a very housing market driven economy.
So people actually own houses instead of renting them out.
Correct. So, and owning a house is a big aspiration over there.
Like in India.
So as soon as, correct, everywhere I suppose. So over there what happened was, all of a sudden mortgage rates dropped down to very low levels. So just before COVID, let's say if they were at around 4% per annum, right? On a, let's say, a fixed rate mortgage for 2 years. All of a sudden they dropped down more and more and more till I think about 2.1%, 2.1%, 2.2%. So actually what the Reserve Bank was trying to achieve was they were hoping that the banks will lend to businesses. Businesses will demand more credit because it's become cheaper. But, and I had also pointed it out at that time, that I don't think the impact that they want to achieve will happen particularly in the way that they want it to happen. And I think there will be these unintended consequences. So I was actually in a conference where I asked that question to someone, from the Reserve Bank, but credit to them, they were operating in a highly uncertain environment, and a lot of criticism is easily done in hindsight. When you're making policy, when all that stuff is happening, is a very complicated calculation to make. So sometimes you get things beautifully right, but sometimes you only learn lessons ex post. It's not easy because the economy is a very complex beast. But the unintended consequence was, in an environment where businesses themselves are not sure about demand, right? Confidence to invest is a very critical factor. So businesses want to be confident that there is demand out there, and there will be demand out there for the next 6 months or 1 year.
Only then they will start.
Then they'll confidently invest and produce. When that confidence goes down, okay, cheap credit is no use. Because if there is no demand, okay, I can't hold inventory without a time limit, because I have storage costs, I have other costs, insurance costs of holding all that inventory. So I can't keep running my factories if I don't know that I can sell that stuff. So what happened actually was, so that's on the demand side. Businesses were not demanding that credit, and housing investors were demanding that credit because it's super cheap now. And not many people lost their jobs. So what happened was, yes, we had lockdowns, but unemployment didn't really go up in New Zealand. In fact, it was at record lows for a long time, very funnily. So unemployment did not go up at all. So we didn't really face that kind of issue.
And what's that one thing which India can learn from New Zealand and New Zealand can kind of learn from India? If you have to just give that one lesson, which both countries need to learn from?
I think one lesson that India can learn from New Zealand is the importance of strong institutions, transparency, fairness, the ability for any citizen to find out information about a public project or something that concerns their life. It could be a policy matter, it could be an application they have made for something. Amazing amounts of transparency, which I think India is getting now. But I think transparency, institutional strength, independence of respect of independent thinking, I think we can pick up a lot from New Zealand on that. I think from India, I think New Zealand can learn a lot. I think we have a very, very rich history and spirit of living as a society with so much diversity. Is absolutely incredible. In New Zealand, I do see some small problems starting to creep up in terms of different parts of society may not be living coexisting that peacefully together, and there's this talk of whereas India, I think, celebrates diversity. We enjoy other people's festivals, their foods, their languages. We learn from them, their clothing, and we imbibe them. I think we celebrate diversity. I think a lot of countries can learn from that. Not just tolerate diversity. I think we should celebrate it because we are all born different. I mean, This is part of nature.
And what's that book that you're currently reading right now, and why?
I'm not actually reading currently anything.
That was a very honest answer.
You can cancel that. Edit that.
Okay.
Okay, next question. Let's not have that. Because I'm traveling and enjoying. What I would like to read next. Okay, maybe can I say what I would like to read next?
I'll ask the question differently then. Are you reading any books right now, and what's that one book which you think everyone should read, or what is on your bucket list right now?
Of late, I'm getting very interested in the history of India, and one author I'm keen on reading, hopefully soon, is P. Sai Deepak. You might have heard his name. I can't remember the name of the book, but both his books I'm looking forward to read. I think he's just come out with his second book. I think those books would be fascinating to read, because I think he really talks about very challenging issues in such a diverse society, but the challenges of managing that diversity as we go ahead in the future. And I think he addresses a lot of those issues in a very, very expert and very insightful manner. So I'm looking forward to those. I'm sorry I can't recall the name of the book.
Yeah, no problem at all. And what's that one advice which you would like to give on the younger people in India as well as world? And
I'm no one to give advice. I think live life
through your experiences.
I think live life according to balance your. I think this should be fairly obvious to anyone who wants to be happy. I think balance. I think health is most important. Take care of your physical and mental health at all points in time. It's not I'll think about it 50 years when I'm old, because what you do now will build up to that time. Take care of your physical and mental health. Whatever components of that might be contributing to your good health, do it religiously every day. Spend time on it. Invest in those things. And in your life or career, combine your passion with what you're good at. Try to do things that interest you, but of course you need to be good at it as well.
Basically, fill that ikigai circle.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. You can't just go all into your passion at a young age. At a young age, you have the energy to work hard as well and tolerate some of the things that you don't enjoy. Right? So build up your financial well-being, and then you can indulge in your interests and your real genuine passions at a later stage as well. So balance your life accordingly. So that's all I would say.
And there's this one last question which one of my followers asked me, and he wanted to ask you basically. So what is that one investment which economists do themselves, like for maintaining their own financial well-being? Because you maintain the country's financial well-being, but what's that thing which is maintaining your own?
In terms of a financial investment,
Yeah.
I think it's a diversification. I think property is very useful because it delivers you your own lifestyle, what you want. So diversify your portfolio. Understand that what your long-term and short-term needs are. So maintain some funds which are liquid, so that you can purchase those things that you want for your life and keep a buffer. But also think long-term. So what are those things that will keep maturing and increasing in value long-term? Property is usually a good thing, especially because I'm in New Zealand. Property is a good thing. But otherwise, find out a good diversification. I think as an economist, diversification is key. Because as you see, everything can go down at any point in time.
Yeah.
So diversify, I would say.
So thank you so much, Harshal, for taking all the time for this. I really enjoyed doing some baatcheet with you today. Initially, we were planning to do this episode in English plus Hindi, but we went all in English. But yeah, that's perfectly all right. And I have genuinely a lot of questions that I wanted to ask you, but we'll keep that for another time.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and yeah, I'm happy to be back anytime. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.